Welcome to quews.news. In this episode of Politics and Current Affairs, we explore the state of human rights and free speech in Pakistan. Pakistan is a country with a complex history and diverse culture, but it has also faced significant challenges when it comes to protecting basic human rights and ensuring free expression. In recent years, the country has seen a number of high-profile cases involving restrictions on the media, limitations on the right to protest, and crackdowns on dissent. The situation is particularly challenging for journalists and activists who often face threats, harassment, and violence simply for doing their job. In some cases, media outlets have been shut down or journalists have been arrested on trumped-up charges, and this has had a chilling effect on the media landscape, with many journalists and media outlets practicing self-censorship in order to avoid retribution. At the same time, there are also voices within Pakistan that are working to promote greater tolerance, equality, and respect for human rights. Human rights defenders, civil society organizations, and concerned citizens are speaking out against abuses and advocating for positive change. These individuals are often risking their own safety and security in order to stand up for what they believe in. In this program, we delve into this important and timely topic, speaking with experts, activists, and citizens on the ground to gain a deeper understanding of the state of human rights and free speech in Pakistan today. We will explore the challenges facing those who are fighting for greater freedoms, as well as the strategies and successes of those who are making progress in promoting human rights and free expression. Join us as we explore this crucial issue and shed light on the ongoing struggle for human rights in Pakistan. This is one of a series of the programs on this issue, as it is a vast subject and it cannot be discussed in just one program. So let's get right into it and try to make sense of an otherwise seemingly impossible labyrinth of issues to deal with. So help us, Lord. Joining me for the discussion today, we have our esteemed guests in the studio. I'd like to introduce, first of all, we have Cecil Chaudhary. He's with the CSW. They are advocates for freedom of religion or belief for all. Welcome to the studio, Cecil.
Thank you.
And we're also being joined by Maheen Paracha. She's with the HRCP, which is the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. Thank you, Maheen, for being here. Okay, so I'll get right into it, and I'll start with you. Let's talk about the main human rights issues that are plaguing Pakistan right now. And as you're working with the HRCP, there's a report that's also come out. So talk us through that.
So I think there are, of course, a wide range of human rights violations that are currently at the forefront, but perhaps among the most prominent would be the state of economic rights. Given the economic crunch the country is currently facing, I think that workers, the lack of a living wage for workers is a serious problem that is perhaps not receiving the emphasis it should. At this point in time, with 40% plus short-term inflation and a minimum wage of less than 30,000, the vast majority of people are unable to afford
make ends meet.
Yes, to make ends meet. The cost of living crisis has become very severe, and because the state has not been able to provide social safety nets to the extent it should be able to, in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of access to education, to justice, to potable water, sanitation. These are very everyday problems. Apart from that, of course, the situation of violence against women and other marginalized communities in terms of trans persons, religious and ethnic minorities is, I think, become worse in the last year or so. We are especially concerned about, I think, press freedom. I think Pakistan is now 145th on the World Press Freedom Index out of perhaps 160 odd countries. It's slid even further in the last couple of years from before. Journalists routinely practice self-censorship because they know there are certain things they can't talk about in the media. So I think there is a very wide range of issues that the state has not been able to address.
So the main issue, again, as we've seen over the years, is the lack of implementation. As you mentioned that the minimum wage, for example, is 30,000 rupees or 35,000 rupees. 26,000
in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
But it's been raised a little bit.
Yeah, up from 26.
Up from 26 to now 30 to 35,000, isn't it?
No, what I understand, I believe it's still under 30.
Still under 30. And even that is not being paid. So the lack of implementation is one of the problems that's been plaguing the Pakistani society and the government for years and years. Is there any way that we can see the laws that are there on the books being implemented in any way or form?
You see, there's actually the framework of laws is, of course, there are problems and loopholes, but there are many perfectly good laws in place. So you say the problem then is implementation. Let's look at something like the 2016 law against honor killings. Now, it is not a bad law, but because of loopholes, for example, that allowed Kandil Baloch's brother to be set free, simply because the prosecution could not provide enough evidence that it was an honor killing, and therefore it was downgraded, as it were, to a murder, and his parents were then able to forgive him. This is the problem with many such laws with regard to human rights, that there are loopholes or they are simply not implemented.
Yeah, that's a major issue, and of course we hope that it's being addressed. Cecil, tell us about your organization and what kind of work are you involved in?
Well, CSW has been working on Pakistan along with more than 20 countries, and our mandate is really to advocate for freedom of religion or belief for all. And the purpose is to work on these countries to document the issues that are being faced by religious and sectarian minorities in the country, and then to amplify that in the international arena with the UK government, with the European Union in Brussels, as well as with the United Nations in Geneva. We work with different partners in the country. So also with Pakistan, we've been working for over 20 years now with partners and trying to document these issues and bring them to the forefront so that the government can take positive steps to address the issues in the country. That's mainly our focus.
So as a result of the work that you've been doing, what are the major sort of issues that you've seen come up again and again?
Well, when it comes to religious and sectarian minorities in Pakistan, we continue to witness their rights, their fundamental rights being violated. And as Maheen said, and as you also mentioned, the problem is that there are some laws which are good if they are implemented. Most of the laws are not implemented in letter and spirit. And to give you an example, in 2014, the Supreme Court of Pakistan issued a historic judgment on the protection and promotion of the rights of religious minorities in Pakistan. To date, that judgment has not been implemented in letter and spirit. So when you don't implement, those protections and those safeguards are not going to be in place, and that will continue to give space for the issues to grow. So if I was to just list down some of the major challenges, blasphemy laws happens to be one of the biggest challenges that is being faced by people in Pakistan, and especially vulnerable marginalized communities like the Christians, the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Ahmadiyas, and even the Shia communities in Pakistan. The other issue that we see connected to blasphemy laws is the mob justice. The state has failed to protect its citizens from mobs who take the law into their own hands, and they dispense justice the way they feel is suitable as per their interpretation. Then you have issues that are revolving around specifically the Hindu and Christian community, where young women and minor girls are being abducted, forcibly converted, and forcibly married. That issue we have seen in the past 5 years, has been growing, and the state really is not done anything in that regard. 2 years back, there was a bill to criminalize forced conversions, but it was discarded on the fact that it was not according to Islam, and so this process continues to take place. Another issue that I would like to highlight is actually, I feel, is the root cause to these problems is our education system, our education policy, our curriculum, and even the content in the textbooks. They violate the rights of religious minorities in the country, and we up till now, none of the policies are in compliance with the constitutional guarantees that the Constitution of Pakistan apparently guarantees to all its citizens. And that is why you see time and again there has been an exclusion and a removal of the role of religious minorities within the textbooks. It started in the 80s and has continued on. Then that transformed into hate and even dangerous speech and biased content within the textbooks. So when that is lying in the textbooks, you are breeding generations or you're teaching generations who do not respect diversity, who do not respect the presence of all these other communities, faith-based communities in the country. And by excluding the role of the religious minorities in the textbooks, once again, they have no regard for the community. So there's a long challenge to address this issue if we really want to address the problems that are being faced by the minorities. But it has to start with the root causes and addressing that, and then you have to look at so many other aspects on how teachers are actually imparting education for that matter.
Yeah, there is a list of many issues that we have to deal with, and of course many others have brought this issue to light and it's being discussed. What is the response of the Pakistani government on the criticism on its human rights record with regards to free speech and the freedom of religion or freedom of assembly or even the freedom for journalists? Because when we talk about the situation in, let's say, India, which is also dismal, we can't really throw stones if we live in a glass house ourselves. So I think it's important that we discuss these issues and address them in our own home, or as they say, look inside and introspect before we can even say that these are the atrocities that are taking place in other places like India and so on and so forth. What's your view on that, and how do you think the government is going to tackle this?
You see, I think one problem is that you can't cherry pick human rights. You can't say that, okay, the government will work only on this because that it sees as some kind of advantage to its vote bank. You have to, as the state, you have to work on all human rights violations in the same way. But in terms of the response of the state, to give you an example, currently Pakistan is going through its 4th Universal Periodic Review, and during its 3rd UPR, the number of recommendations it received from member countries actually increased from the 2nd UPR as opposed to going down. And that gives you, I think, an idea of what the situation is. And among them, I think, the sort of issues that other member states were most concerned about were freedom of religion or belief, especially violence against women, forced conversions, blasphemy laws, and so on. But the state's response, I think, has been seriously wanting. They have not put their money where their mouth is. An institution like the National Commission for Human Rights, for example, remained without a chairperson for almost 2 years. That is on behalf of the state, that is a statutory autonomous body meant to monitor and redress human rights violations. That could not happen. The National Commission on the Status of Women was without a chairperson for, I think, over a year. When you give that little emphasis to your own institutions, then what possibly can you expect to gain? And the problem also is that the state has come down very hard on human rights defenders and civil society organizations that are trying to do their own work. The government has put in place, for example, the Charities Commission Acts, which makes it harder for NGOs to register, to receive funds, and that squeezes the space available for human rights defenders to work in the private sphere. That gives you an idea of what their attitude towards human rights is.
Well, that's really sad, because if you want to have a society that is progressive and inclusive, then that is certainly not the way to go about it. And we believe that the previous dispensation has been a democratic one. So why is it that a democratic government is unable to implement its own laws for that matter?
I think largely it's for lack of political will. Currently, for example, you look at the situation in the country. Again, I mentioned short-term inflation, the cost of living crisis, but the emphasis in the news or in general conversations is about the tussle, for example, between the judiciary and the government. So day-to-day violations are not getting anywhere near the kind of emphasis that they need.
Yeah. Well, in your opinion, Cecil, what do you think is the role of religion and culture in terms of shaping attitudes towards human rights in a Pakistani context?
Well, I think, Pakistan has got a lot of diversity in it, whether it comes from ethnic communities or religious communities. And that diversity needs to be celebrated, it needs to be respected, it needs to be regarded. I think it's really important for a society to understand all the different communities, all the different type of people and backgrounds that exist in the country, because that is the only way that we can come together as a society. But if we start ghettoizing each other on the basis of our faith, then the division will just continue on and there will be no stopping to it. And that is what that I feel is happening right now in our country.
Well, a lot of emphasis has been laid on diversity, as you mentioned, and we've seen successive governments, especially in Sindh, where there's a large Hindu population. We've seen Bilawal Bhutto, going out and trying to celebrate Holi and other Diwali or such occasions. But at the same time, we've also seen a backlash from religious fundamentalists against the mixing of communities. Why do you think that is the case?
Well, it's a mindset issue, and we are actually battling this mindset right now. You can celebrate, that's really great, it gives out a good message. But if the state is unable to protect the fundamental rights of those communities, then what good is it at the end? Yes, celebrating will give a good message, but the state's duty is to ensure that every citizen is accorded the same status which the Constitution gives. But we don't see that happening in practice. And you mentioned about Sindh, that's where majority of the forced conversion cases against the Hindus are taking place. So on one side, Bilawal may be going and doing that, but at the same time, these cases are increasing. And the Hindu community is being constantly targeted in the province of Sindh. And then the state partners with such people who are part of the problem, rather than partnering with the civil society and taking them on board as partners. You see, the civil society is not there to just criticize the government. Civil society is a watchdog which you need to take their information and work with them to try and address the issues. But the civil society in Pakistan is being viewed as being anti-government or anti-state. And that's precisely why the NGOs who are trying to do this work are facing so many hurdles in the past 4 or 5 years, where the Economic Affairs Division had put a blanket ban on any international funding coming in. And that's why they were not being able to, and still are not able to operate freely.
But that's rather an unfortunate picture that you're painting, and I really am at a loss of words to see where we're going to go with this sort of a situation. So we also have the world which is changing, and technology and social media is also playing a part in there. We've seen a lot of journalists who were taken off mainstream media, who then took the recourse to things like YouTube and made their own channels and still are talking about real issues, and they are not censoring a lot of the information that's coming to them. How do you think social media has had an impact on these regulations on the media, for example?
I think it's had a considerable impact, but if I can talk about more generally in terms of the impact it's had on human rights defenders as well as journalists, it has given a lot of marginalized voices the opportunity to actually speak up. To give you an example, Balochistan is considered an information black hole. The news you get from the region is sparse, it is on particular issues, certain things are simply not talked about. But there is a very vibrant, albeit small, but a vibrant community of activists on social media, Baloch women especially, Baloch journalists, Baloch civil society members, who monitor violations on the ground, report them, mobilize around them, hold, whether it's Twitter spaces or YouTube videos, which actually provides a window into what is happening. And I think without that, we would literally have very little information as to what is going on.
Well, in your opinion, Cecil, what are the steps that the government has taken to protect journalists, for example? There are some organizations, in fact, that have been named after this very cause. The Society for the Protection of Journalists is one of them that comes to mind. Does it really have an impact in society?
I personally think that there are no protections for journalists and for all those voices who are trying to address the issues. I feel that the state has been very harsh in targeting such elements, and there is free speech is not an option, and that sort of puts pressure on marginalized communities or vulnerable communities, because they are already living in fear, and then they become afraid to even raise their voice against the
oppression.
Yeah. So you find that there's a strong crackdown on journalists who are speaking up, and you mentioned about social media. I personally feel that this last decade, the challenges and the problems that have grown is because social media has been used for the wrong reasons, probably even globally. But
please elaborate what you mean.
Well, in the sense that certain groups with an extremist mindset have got a free hand to promote their ideology,
spread disinformation, or
and
create hate speech.
There's no way to stop that, and so they'll gather more followers, and that will give rise to more and more problems because there's no check on that. I don't mean to clamp down on free speech, but it's a very fine line where you have to see whether that speech is inciting others to violence against other communities or vulnerable communities.
So in that way, you're advocating for stronger blasphemy laws?
Well, we've seen it in the form of various groups that have used social media in that to that advantage.
But at the same time, we also talk about the problem that blasphemy laws actually create within the society, because they're used to target individuals. They're used purely on the basis of lies. If you want to target somebody or if you want to steal their property, one of the easiest ways to accuse them of blasphemy.
Yeah, because the threshold of evidence is so low that it is extremely easy. And as Cecil rightly pointed out, now it's not even about, we noticed something interesting, that last year the number of reported blasphemy cases actually went down. But the number of cases of, say, mob lynching, there was a distinct uptick in that. Because now it's not about what the law says, what the law doesn't say in this particular issue. It is that any whiff of a rumor is enough to mobilize a mob at the gates of whether it's a police station or a factory.
Yeah, to give you an example, in 2018, when Asia Bibi was acquitted by the Supreme Court of Pakistan, the country was paralyzed by these extremist groups for 3 to 4 days. Despite the fact that the Supreme Court, which is the apex court of the country, had acquitted her, it meant that she had not committed that blasphemy. Yet, the mobs did not accept the verdict of the court. And the state was, again, unable to do anything about that. So that's where the problem is.
That's like an impossible situation to deal with. I mean, what do you really do? Well, what are the implications of the blasphemy law on society as a whole? We've touched upon it. We recently saw a Chinese engineer working on the Dasu Dam being accused of blasphemy. We saw a Sri Lankan manager at a factory being lynched. And we see these episodes periodically. Some woman being accused in her house. So it just keeps on going on, and there seems to be no end to it. And do you not think that this is going to be detrimental for Pakistan as a society, Pakistan as a country, and also its standing in the world is going to be affected? So there are so many negative connotations attached with this, the misuse of the blasphemy law. How does the government even intend to tackle this issue?
I'm not sure that the government intends to tackle the issue or that it is even a priority at this point in time. There's been no movement to do so.
But we've seen the government actually step in to protect these people from mob lynching, and if you look at the record, not many people have been sentenced to death for blasphemy over the years. It's the conviction rate for the blasphemy law is quite low, as I understand.
Yes, as in no executions have taken place, but sentencing has to, I'm not sure the estimated death row population is maybe about 50 or 60 people roughly are on death row on blasphemy allegations. So no executions, but that is not something to be proud of.
Because that's a moratorium on executions.
An unofficial one. There have been no executions since I think 2018 or so.
But those people do end up rotting in jail for the rest of their lives, which is again, maybe worse in some ways.
You see, for example, certainly in a case like Junaid Hafiz, for example. Now, Junaid Hafiz has been on death row, has been incarcerated for I think now 11 years. Even again recently, his hearing was put off. Many prisoners are kept in solitary confinement, supposedly for their own protection. But what they go through, what their families go through, the fact that their lawyers are also under threat, judges are afraid to give, especially at the district and sessions level, court level, judges are afraid to go against the grain.
They're even afraid to listen to these cases in most cases.
Yes, exactly. So
it's a terrible situation, but unfortunately it's true. Cecil, tell us about the effect on minorities by the restrictions that are put in place by religious fanatics or people of influence within a community. What impact does that have on the psychological sort of effects on people?
Well, the first thing is that they're living their life in fear. They are scared to even speak up against any of the atrocities that may happen against them. And they, in the past couple of years, we saw a lot of the minorities fleeing to countries like Thailand and Sri Lanka and Malaysia to seek asylum because they just don't feel safe. And that transforms into that everyday life of theirs, whether the students in school, they're facing those problems, whether in your workplace or generally. And within the lower courts and with the police, the attitudes are such that then they do not go to seek justice because they feel that they will be treated with a biased and a negative attitude from from the protectors of the law.
We had an interesting case recently, just to kind of add to this. We found there was last year about 90 plus desecrations of Ahmadiyya graves and of sites of worship. And one of our fact-finding missions in Gujranwala found that the police or the district administration was actually complicit. And when we asked them, why do you even know that this was not the community was not violating the constitution or the law, they said that, well, look, if we don't remove minarets from sites of worship that belong to the Jamaat-e-Ahmadiyya, we will have a lynch mob at our doorstep the next day. So the district administration, the police are all complicit because many of them also simply don't know that it is not against the law for the Jamaat-e-Ahmadiyya to profess and practice their faith.
Right, now let's bring the topic onto the issue of women's rights. Of course, that's another major issue, and recently we saw within the Pakistani press and broadcast media this slogan of Mera Jism Meri Marzi, which means my body, it's my volition. why is it not understood, and why is it taken out of context? Why is it made to mean something which it is entirely not, and not understood in its correct perspective? Why is that the case? It's a simple enough slogan.
I think that it is, you have to see how deeply entrenched patriarchy and misogyny are in Pakistani culture to see why something as simple as slogans like this. So even there was one, Apni roti khud hi garam karo, that created a whole furor over the idea of women having the right to mobility, to refuse. But you see, when the state, when the former Prime Minister of Pakistan can effectively say that women invite rape by the clothes they wear, or when recently there was Nabil Kabul, PPP leader also, who made a rather crass remark about rape. This is internalized so deeply that reversing this is going to take a very, very long time.
And what's the way to reverse it? Because obviously there is a problem of cognition or comprehension at play here. As Cecil mentioned earlier, that the children being taught in schools need to be taught that you need to respect other human beings, whether they're men or women or transgender or anything that they may be. That is besides the point. And basic human respect is something that has to be taught to our children. Why is it not the case?
I would say in the past 4 decades, society has become extremely radicalized, and because the rule of law has not been, the state has not enforced its writ on such things, and they've allowed that space to grow. So, if you want to address these issues, you mentioned earlier about, certain examples of where mob lynchings have been curbed. Those are individual heroes who have taken that step. There's no systematic process to address this in the right way, and it has to start. As Mine said, things require a lot of time, and for that you have to go on the long haul. You have to change the mindset. You have to not just start with education, but you have to start with sensitizing the law enforcement agencies and the lower courts, providing protections to the lower courts so that they can dispense justice, and sensitizing the security apparatus like the police force in dealing with every citizen regardless of their creed in an equal manner, an unbiased and impartial manner.
Absolutely. And what do you attribute this deterioration to over the years? Because we mentioned that Pakistan has been a pluralistic society with diverse, communities and religions and sects and what have you. But what do you attribute this deterioration to over the years?
I think from the 80s, it started off with, under the martial law regime of General Ziaul Haq, where we had to prepare mujahideens and go in and send them into Afghanistan to fight against the USSR, and that narrative was probably went into that direction where you just glorified only one majority faith and excluded all the others, and that process has just grown over the period of time. And as I mentioned earlier, even when I was in school, I read about the role of religious minorities. I read about my own father in school. But 4 years later, in 1990, those chapters were removed from the textbooks. So what was the goal of removing those chapters? And this process has been going on for the past 4 decades.
And we're seeing that same process taking place in India right now, with the entire Mughal history being removed from the textbooks, from Indian school books. Yeah. And it's rather unfortunate that we don't seem to learn.
And just to add to that, the state would probably say that, we have brought back chapters into the textbooks. Yes, they have, but you have you've isolated them. There is a chapter in the history textbooks now which says the role of religious minorities. Why does it have to be separate? Why can't it be integrated into, generally with all other majority Muslim heroes also?
Yeah, that is a problem.
You're otherizing them even while bringing it back. You're still not addressing it in that way. So you're sort of creating this separate section as though it's some favor that you're really doing to society.
To your own citizens.
And
Yes.
I think that applies to women as well. The systematic erasure of women has occurred in the same way because they are considered not mainstream. They're not mainstream the way they should be.
Well, there's another aspect to it, and we've seen as the technology has grown, the use of surveillance technology on citizens and activists and politicians. We've seen so many audio, video leaks happening all over the place. What impact does that have on the society as a whole, and why should it be curbed, or why should it not be curbed? What's your view on that?
Well, at a very basic level, the idea of privacy laws, not having privacy laws as they should be, simply means that people will be much more careful about what they say. As it is, as I mentioned earlier, many journalists, it is routine for them to resort to self-censorship. But if you know as a citizen that what you say, for example, in this space or any other space, certainly in Pakistan, that you could be recorded, you will then simply not say it.
Yeah, that's very unfortunate, and we've seen that happening internationally as well when we talk about the cases of Julian Assange or when we talk about Edward Snowden for that matter, and there are many others that are also facing the brunt of the iron might of the powers that be. What's the real point here? Because we talk about the freedom of expression and human rights and the United Nations. What is their take on this entire thing?
On freedom of expression specifically?
Yeah, the targeting of journalists and the freedom to bring information out to the public.
Well, I mean, again, there are international mechanisms in place to protect freedom of expression, but to the extent that they are successful in Pakistan is very much a moot point. I mean, some steps may have been taken when the current government came into power. They rolled back the controversial Pakistan Media Development Authority, which was then going to become one mechanism for oversight of all media. That was rolled back. But at the same time, problematic laws such as the Pakistan Electronic Crimes PICA.
Okay, PICA laws, yes.
PICA, there are problematic sections there that have not been rolled back. Periodically you see rules being issued that impinge on freedom of expression.
And when we talk about the actions that can be taken by, let's say, international organizations like yours, Cecil, is there any good work that is being done on the ground to protect vulnerable people? What exactly are you also involved in those terms?
Okay, well, we can't, force the government of Pakistan to address these issues. What we can do is go to the powers that that matter. For example, the UK government. The UK provides aid to Pakistan every year, and Pakistan was one of the biggest recipients of that aid. That's where the government of UK can, in their dialogue with the Pakistani government, ensure that the aid that is coming, for example, for education or for capacity building of judiciary and police, is going in the right place, and it's not being misused in that ways. The GSP plus status that Pakistan holds is due for renewal next year. Those are areas, because they have 27 international conventions that Pakistan must comply with. Those are areas where we can ensure. And then again, lastly, for the United Nations, as Mahin also mentioned, there are conventions that Pakistan has ratified. So Pakistan has to ensure that at least the conventions that they have ratified are being complied with.
Mahin, would you like to comment on this?
I think yes, we are a party to a number of conventions, but we have made inadequate progress, not only in implementing those, but also looking at other conventions that we should have signed. One prominent example being the convention concerning enforced disappearances. Despite a lot of advocacy to this effect, we have still not signed that. And as far as implementation goes, whether it's the UN Convention Against Torture, whether it's CEDAW, we have not been able to show even near adequate progress on these fronts.
Do you think social media has had an effect or impact on highlighting these issues? Do you think that the use of social media such as Twitter and YouTube, etc., really matters in maybe improving the situation in any way, or do you think that it's really not much that it does?
I think if you did not have social media to raise the voice it does, that would be a very discernible gap. That said, I grant you that social media, the reach of social media is not as ingrained as perhaps in other countries. Twitter, for example, is not accessible to all people. But even those voices are now beginning to reach further afield. So as I said before, in places like in parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or in Balochistan, movements like the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement were largely mobilized because of social media. And the same goes for movements in Balochistan as well as in other parts of the country.
And the use of social media by journalists, in your opinion, Cecil, does it have an impact? And do you think that people are able to glean the facts? And is there a divide between mainstream media and social media where people are more trusting towards what they hear on social media rather than mainstream media? Is it part of the propaganda?
I think social media is easily accessible, and so I think even the youth, a lot of the youth depends on social media, so it does have an impact. And I feel that there are incidents where where social media has actually highlighting an issue has had a positive effect. And Mahin is absolutely right. If that was not there, we wouldn't even have known of those issues happening or those incidents taking place. So there is a lot of positives to take out of social media, but again I come back to the thing that the negatives are more. The use of social media for the wrong reasons is
it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And I think also currently now the use of fake news or
Hate speech
or giving impressions of incidents that occurred that did not, which certainly certain political parties have used to their advantage as well. That is something to be wary of.
Disinformation. Okay, that's a major issue. What we've seen in Pakistan recently and over the years is a lot of political instability. And what impact does that political instability have on human rights overall?
Instability essentially means that, for a start, it diverts attention away from human rights. As I said before, in the current economic crunch, the fact that the tussle between the judiciary and the government is dominating the airwaves or dominating conversations at the expense of the cost of living crisis tells you exactly how political instability then diverts attention away from everyday human rights issues.
And what's your opinion on that? Do you think political instability has a negative effect on human rights and the development of any country or society as a whole?
The human rights is nowhere near on the radar for for the political parties. They're so busy in that power struggle that is going on that these issues are nowhere on the agenda, not being prioritized. And an example of that was some of our partners in Pakistan who were working on a sort of an initiative to address, because of the upcoming elections, to address education, which is something which is everyone's right. Partners witnessed that parliamentarians just didn't show up at any of the consultations that they were wanting them to come to at least listen to the issues, because they're just too busy in other things. So it just shows that they're not giving priority to human rights at all.
Well, there's also a lot of activism on the grassroots level, on the ground in Pakistan. So what role can civil society play to address these challenges? And you can both answer this question. What's your opinion, Cecil?
Civil society, Pakistan has a very robust civil society, and I think civil society has always been at the forefront on addressing these issues. But if the state is not going to allow the space for them to operate, then there's only this much that they can do, and they will continue, because civil society has now been sort of entangled in this whole process of trying to put their houses in order to be able to receive the funding to be able to operate. So when they're stuck in that, then the focus of the actual work that they need to do on addressing the cause gets compromised.
And diluted, of course. Maheen, what's your opinion?
And there are, I think, also certain issues that perhaps is related to the media. Certain issues that, there is a small but a robust labor rights movement, grassroots labor rights movement in Pakistan. But you don't see them in the mainstream conversations at all. I mean, in a country where the level of unionization is, I think, maybe between 2 and 4%, how can you possibly expect to be able to protect workers' rights when you cannot offer them freedom of association?
And what about the role and the limitations of the judiciary in trying to address these issues? Of course, this is a major part of what the judiciary is supposed to do, is to provide justice to people. And why do you think they're so limited, and why their hands are tied when it comes to providing justice?
I'm not sure that their hands are tied in a blanket sense. I think that the judiciary is capable of providing justice. In some cases it has. But again, I think recently, because they too have been caught up in a political tussle, that has taken attention away from, if nothing else, the sheer number of pending cases tells you how much of a problem this is. I think it's maybe 1.9 million cases or whatever still pending in all the courts.
So how damaging is it for institutions overall, the politicization of these institutions in terms of the progress of the country overall?
Sorry, just say that again.
Like the damage that is caused to these institutions as a result of the politicization that has taken place, let's say, for example, in the judiciary or in other organizations, how damaging is it for the country's progress?
I think what you've seen in the last 5 years is what one of our HRCP members calls the judicialization of politics and politicization of the judiciary. And this has been a serious problem because, as opposed to keeping the trichotomy of powers intact, you've got the lines are being blurred.
And that's rather unfortunate. Cecil, in your opinion, there's another very important aspect of Pakistani society, and that is national security, which is paramount. So what effect has national security and counter-terrorism had on free speech and the consequences of that?
I think Maheen would probably be able to answer that better, but with the past 2 decades of the war on terror that went on, it has had, there has been a big a damaging effect on the overall society. And so it's not just minorities, but all citizens in the country are affected by this. But then the issues of security, it means that you are going to curb space for all citizens to be able to freely exercise their rights, because there's a security issue, and on the basis of that you use that to enforce restrictions on ordinary citizens. I mean, that's the way I view it.
Would you like to comment on that?
I'll just add one thing, that I think so long as you continue to approach development through a security lens, you cannot expect human rights to improve. In a situation where, for example, nationalists, whether from Sindh or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or Punjab or Balochistan, run the risk of being, for example, disappeared forcibly, and the rationale that is given is they were a security risk. That is a serious problem, because their fundamental human rights, their right to a fair trial, is being eliminated.
Well, thank you very much, Maheen Piracha and Cecil Chaudhary, for taking out the time.
Thank you very much.
And we really appreciate that you came and you spoke about this very delicate issue. And to our audience, we'd say that please do share your comments and your feedback with us. Tell us what you think about this all-important issue, and what ideas do you have to make a better Pakistan for our future generations. And on that note, it's goodbye.